Good evening. The inquiry in Aberdeen into the deaths of 45 men in the world's worst civilian helicopter disaster has now concluded. Lengthy written evidence has been submitted and graphic accounts have been given of how the Chinook fell from the sky off Shetland last November. The two men who survived the tragedy, pilot Push Vade and Shell trainee technician Eric Morans, have gone through the harrowing experience of reliving their ordeal in the witness box. Tonight in this special programme we intend to look at the crash, the possible cause of it, and the future of the Chinook. There are many imponderables. Indeed, crash investigators have still to file their final reports. But like Sheriff Principal Stuart Bell, who sat at the inquiry and who'll give his full findings in writing at a later date, our intention tonight is to fact-find, not fault-find. The 6th was just another day for the men on Shell's Brent Charlie platform. But for some working there and on the nearby Shell Delta rig, there was an air of anticipation. The powerful twin-rotor Chinook approaching the Brentfield was coming to take them home, but only one of the 44 was to make it. The destination of the Chinook, call sign Foxtrot Charlie, was 135 miles away, Sombra Airport on Shetland's southern tip. The helicopter skimmed over the choppy November waters of the North Sea. Most of the journey was uneventful, but just after the pilot had made his routine 2 minutes to landing call to Sombra Control, the Chinook disappeared from the radar screen. Without warning, it had plunged 500 feet into the sea, only a mile and a half off the coastline. In a few terrifying seconds, the world's worst civil helicopter disaster claimed the lives of all but 2 of the men aboard. At a stroke, more lives were lost than in 20 years of flights to and from offshore installations in the North Sea. But by a miracle, by a twist of fate, 2 men survived. 2 men who now have to live with the nightmare of the crash. 45-year-old Captain Push Vade, who piloted Foxtrot Charlie, spent many weeks recovering from his injuries. In the days after the disaster, he described how he'd heard a whining sound just seconds before the helicopter plunged into the sea. Then there was a bang, the cockpit window shattered, and suddenly he was underwater. 20-year-old Eric Morans, a trainee technician with Shell, was the other man who was able to struggle to the surface. He was returning from his 7th trip offshore. If his present feelings prevail, he'll never fly in a helicopter again. A combination of tiredness and boredom led him to slumber for most of the journey to Sombra.
It was just a perfectly normal flight until I heard, it must have been very close to landing, I heard the voice announcement coming over, which tells you, 5 minutes to landing, prepare, check your seatbelts.
For Eric Morans and Captain Push Vade, the next few minutes were a struggle for survival, a fight against the fiercely cold waters of the North Sea.
I hadn't a clue where I was, why I was there, or what on earth was happening to me. Miraculously, a life raft bobbed up, almost fully inflated, maybe 10 feet away from me. It was very close, and I just had to make a couple of kicks, motions towards it, and I held on to the side until I could get my thoughts together, because I was really shocked, stunned.
Routine training trip, and we just got airborne, and we turned off towards the east, just about to leave the airfield, when I suddenly noticed an oil slick about 2 miles out to sea with a couple of bumps on it. And as we were flying across there to investigate more fully, we heard that the air traffic control were calling a Chinook helicopter and asking it to, where it was and what it was doing, because they'd lost it from radar. And we got to this oil slick, and we suddenly realized that there was wreckage there, and we realized then that it must have been the wreckage of the Chinook helicopter, and in fact one piece of wreckage did have the aircraft numbers on it. And when we were hovering there, looking among this wreckage, we spotted 2 survivors who were still on the surface, hanging on to, one was hanging on to a bit of wreckage, and the other was hanging on to one of the dinghies.
The next thing I remember is seeing a body being lifted out of the water, and the helicopter seemed to be moving away from me. I was absolutely petrified that I was going to be left. I mean, I've never been so scared in my life. And then...
Did you shout at the helicopter?
No, I couldn't shout. I tried to wave to him, but it was in vain. I was no able to do anything really to help myself. I just was hoping and praying to God that somebody would see me and I would be rescued. The next thing I remember, I don't remember being lifted out of the water at all. The next thing I remember is actually sitting on the helicopter after obviously being winched up on board.
We looked around to see if anybody else was alive, and by this time bodies were floating up to the surface, but they were very obviously dead. This was probably about 10 minutes later, so after 10 minutes under the surface, there was very little hope they would be alive.
When you were in the helicopter, in the Chinook, you were sitting beside the emergency exit, but where should you have been sitting in the helicopter?
I should have been sat at the 2 rows back on the other side of the helicopter, and there is actually I believe four emergency exits, 2 front and 2 rear, and I wouldn't actually have been sat. I would have had an emergency exit only a couple of seats in front of me, but that's where I should have been sat.
Do you think that sort of twist of fate, which meant that you sat beside the emergency exits, has actually saved your life?
Well, it definitely did, because I did almost nothing to save myself. It was just luck, grace of God, if you want to call it that. I did nothing to save myself. The chap, whoever it would have been, who was sat in that seat, was going to be the one who managed miraculously to get out.
Very soon after the accident, crash investigators established what happened. There had been a catastrophic fatigue failure of a spiral bevel ring gear in the Chinook's forward transmission, but determining why hasn't been so straightforward. The spiral bevel ring gear is on the forward rotor of the Chinook. It combines with another gear to link the helicopter's drive shaft to the vertical rotor shaft. This is a spiral bevel ring gear. In January 1985, changes were made to it on the recommendation of the Chinook's manufacturers, Boeing. This was because the type of bolts which attached it to the vertical shaft had been loosening in some of the aircraft, though it was a problem that engineers at BIH, or British Airways Helicopters as it was then, thought they'd resolved without need to modify the gear. Basically, the modification from the Mark V to Mark VI gearbox entailed bigger bolts and bigger holes, along with a different shim. That's the large washer which lies inside the bevel ring gear. When the Department of Transport Accident Investigation Branch pinpointed fatigue failure, they said the origin type associated with fretting between the ring gear mounting flange and shim. But the theory which began to gain more credence involved a phenomenon called crevice corrosion. The shim of the Mark V gearbox was scalloped around each bolt head. The Mark VI shim was flat. It's thought the combination of the larger bolts and holes and the plain flat shim, tiny and minute changes to the layman, may have trapped oil condensate and a chlorine substance from the salty sea air, possibly hydrochloric acid, in the gear. This, the theory goes on, led to corrosion which ate its way gradually round the gear wheel. When the corrosion crevices joined up, the wheel suddenly cracked and the vital link with the drive shaft was broken, with drastic consequences. The giant Chinook was introduced to the North Sea in 1981, providing long-range, non-stop flights from Aberdeen to the oil fields of the East Shetland Basin. Since then, they ferried thousands of men to and from oil installations. But the Chinooks belonging to British International Helicopters now stand idle in their hangar in Aberdeen, even though they've been cleared to fly by the Civil Aviation Authority. But only recently, reservations about the aircraft have been revived. A military Chinook crashed in the Falklands, and the Norwegian Helicopter Service Company grounded their fleet of 3 after one machine had an engine failure and was forced to land. Previously, the Shetland tragedy apart, there had been worrying, if unrelated incidents, like the ditching in the North Sea in 1984, when 44 passengers and 3 crew had to be rescued.
50,000 people killed on the roads every year. You know, the people who've taken that sort of approach. So the feedback is mixed, but certainly the majority of it has been more anti, shall we say, than pro. Chinook.
Difficult for you, has it been at Shell, to get over the tragedy of last November?
We haven't got over it. We'll never get over it. That's, I mean, that's, if you're involved in that sort of accident, that stays with you for the rest of your life. You know, unquestionably. I will never forget that.